Hey guys, this is the Friday review day. This is uh, April the 3rd. This is the end of our first week of online learning. We've been covering the civil rights movement all week. Behind me, Martin Luther King Jr., a little video I found on YouTube. We're looking at this for 2 weeks as far as how we've been covering the civil rights movement. This is the end of the first week. By the end of this week, we focus pretty much on what you've done your key terms and your questions on this week, and then what you wrote your one-page essay on Wednesday has all been about uh, the fight for equality for African Americans. Of course, the leader of that's that man right there, Martin Luther King Jr. He's not the only one, but of course, he's probably the most famous one, the most known one. As we finish off this week and go into the weekend, I'm going to leave you with a few little things, let you go kind of treasure hunting over the weekend with a little virtual field trip. But also, that's kind of segueing us into the first of next week, Monday. On Monday, we'll begin week 2 of the civil rights movement. And pretty much the rest of the week next week, I'm going to give you more kind of exploring type things. It's not so much reading and answering stuff as much as it is I want you to kind of go off and check out a few things. We'll leave you a lot of video links next week uh, so that you can watch stuff and comment on it. Nothing really major, nothing really big, not as encompassing as this week's was, but still, hopefully, get you some knowledge. On Wednesday next week, we're also going to kind of touch base on everybody else getting civil rights. And of course, that's women continuing to improve their treatment. We're going to talk about Gloria Steinem for just a few minutes. Of course, Native American, Mexican American, really any Hispanic American, especially here in Florida, whether it's Cuban, Puerto Rican, uh, really anyone from Central or South America. So it's not just African American civil rights that we're seeing here in this lesson these 2 weeks, but obviously it's the main focus. Now, what I want to do today on Friday, kind of to wrap up this first week, is just go through a few things. Now, the first thing I want to kind of go through is just simply touch base with you on how you've been doing this week. You know, the biggest thing that I've noticed this week is that you've done fairly good about being here and being a part of things and commenting when I've asked you to. Some of you have been a little more ghost than others, but I have been able to at least notice that you've been working as the week goes. I'm not asking you to do a whole lot. Like I said, I'm going to give you your big assignment for the week every Monday, and that gives you the whole 5 days of the week to get it done. But I do want you to get that stuff done. You do got to check in. Remember, next Monday, comment on your class periods, Google Classroom, because the post on Monday is basically your attendance. I'm going to call attendance on Monday. You say here uh, on the Google Classroom by just simply commenting on the assignment. And that way I know you're checking in, you're a part of it. Every week, then we go back and we take attendance for the week before. So make sure you're doing that on Mondays. Some of you did good with that. Some of you didn't do so good. I've had to send out a lot of parent emails and phone calls and things like that, trying to get touch base with you. Talk to each other. You've got friends in my class, hopefully, and whether it's your period or another period, communicate with each other. Make sure y'all are getting your work done. Because that's important. I want you to keep your grades up. Now, next week, we're going to do kind of a interactive type thing where I'm going to give you a few things to look at, whether it's on YouTube or whether it's virtual tours to look at over the course of Monday, hopefully through Wednesday. And that's going to be your big thing. I'm going to give you some questions to answer, some discussion type things to answer off that as you go next week. None of it's long. We're talking maybe a paragraph at the most, just a few sentences really. But you just commenting on the things that you saw or what you got out of different sections. So I'm still putting that together. But that's going to be Monday. Next Wednesday, you're going to have your test on the civil rights movement. It will be open book, open notes. But understand it's going to be a little more challenging. No essay next week like I gave you this week. No short response or long one-page response. I guess it's not very short, but it will be a test. So you need to be prepared for that. More than likely on Google Forms. Make sure next Wednesday you log in and you take the test. So Monday, get your assignment. Next Wednesday, get your test. I'll, again, at the end of next week, we'll post and then tell you to wrap things up. And hopefully we'll get grades. Now, I'm going to be going through the grade book today, posting a grade for you for your week assignment for this week, which is last week of March, first week of April. And then I'll also be putting in your 85 points, or give or take, for what you wrote on your written response. And remember, you're getting 10 points a week just for simply commenting on Monday's assignment and telling me that you're here. So just so I know participation. Starting next week, if I don't see you, if I'm not getting communications from you, then I'm going to I'll have to turn you in. I've sent people emails and phone calls and everything else through student message. I've already done that 2 or 3 times this week. I'm going to do it one more time today when I get through, Friday when I get through putting stuff in the grade book if I don't have your stuff turned in, just to remind you you're missing. So next week it starts being turned over to the social workers and to the admin, and they'll start hunting you down a little bit more. I just need you interactive. I'm not taking much time out of you. Just try to be involved. Okay. One other thing. What was the other thing I wanted to get into today? Let's see. Oh, we're going to try to do a Zoom class one day next week. I put that up on the announcements. If you haven't noticed, I've been putting announcements up every day and then deleting them at night. And that way I'm trying to keep the page so it's not too cluttered, our Google Classroom, so it's not too cluttered. It's easy when you pull it up, you see what we're talking about as current as we can. But every morning I've been posting an announcement for the day. I was on Zoom most of the week during my office hours, 9 to 12, but it was a lot of me waiting around and not a lot of seeing you. Most of the communication I got was either email or text messages through my Google Voice text message. So, what I'm thinking is maybe Tuesday of next week, I'm going to post a Zoom meeting. I'm going to probably do one meeting in the morning, one maybe in midday or early afternoon, and then I'm going to get on again next Tuesday night and do one at night. And there'll be 3 attempts for you to get on and meet with me face-to-face live. We'll do it maybe as a review for the open book test. We'll do it as a review of what you've been studying. We may just shoot the breeze for a little bit and just talk. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. We're not going to get too involved, but it's just a good face-to-face with most of you. Again, I've seen some of you. I've talked to several of you, but it's just another way of communicating with you. And I hope the YouTube thing is helping out a little bit, give you face-to-face instruction with me sometimes. All right, let's get down to the brass tacks and let's talk about what else is going on. Let's look at what we've been doing here. Let me share with you my screen so everybody can see what's going on. There's the Zoom page. Let's leave it. Yeah, let's go over to Google Classroom. I'm just going to use first period stuff every week, just again to show you an example of what's going on. You can see that here's Thursday's announcements. Haven't deleted those off yet, but I will in just a second. Obviously, when you look at this, Friday's announcements will be up and Friday's classwork assignment. Remember, when you come on the Classroom each time, at the top, you'll have the option of the stream. The stream has the announcement and the classwork on it. You can click on the classwork and you'll see classwork right there, and you can keep up with each day and each week's things that's going on. So make sure that's what you do when you get on there each week. Now, if I click on assignments this week, what I want to start out with today is kind of just do a little review of what we've been covering this week. I'm going to do it on the first couple of lessons. I'm going to go to the old little guided reading lesson plans because they're much, much simpler and much, much smaller condensed versions. So let's talk about lesson 1. This is what you had questions on back on Monday. First of all, the big people that are talked about here in lesson 1 starts off with Thurgood Marshall. Remember, Thurgood Marshall was the African-American attorney who's going to take the case of Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will rule that schools being segregated was unconstitutional, and that will begin the desegregation of the school systems across the country. And it was not an easy thing. Whether it was colleges, whether it was high schools, whether it was elementary schools, it took a lot to desegregate schools. And it wasn't just schools, it was, anything from buses to water fountains to businesses. All these different places began the slow process of desegregating, ending the separation and bringing everybody together. Remember, Thurgood Marshall also later on becomes the first African-American on the Supreme Court and will actually be a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at one point. Rosa Parks also mentioned when we talked about her on Wednesday's assignment, when we were talking about civil disobedience. Remember, civil disobedience is peaceful, fighting back without fighting back. You do things like sit-ins, you do things like the bus boycott, you do things like the March on Washington, like behind me with Martin Luther King Jr. So you do these things to be disobedient to the way things are, but you don't get violent with them. Rosa Parks, of course, refused to get off the bus or get out of her seat in the white section of the bus in Montgomery. It led to a bus boycott after she was arrested. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. is the leader of the civil rights movement. He leads what's called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And then you got a group out of Memphis, Tennessee, that's going to start the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they're the actual ones that start the civil disobedience. Things like sit-ins or protest forms. Remember, Gandhi is from India is the man that they will kind of get that from. I'm going to skip down here just to the question and kind of review over some things. What actions had been taken in the past? President Franklin is the question. What action did President Franklin Roosevelt take in response to the protest for Jim Crow laws? All right. It says up here that in response to protests, President Franklin Roosevelt issued a presidential decree outlawing racial discrimination in all federal agencies and war-related companies. Nearly 1 million African Americans wound up serving in World War II. World War II is actually a big catalyst, reason why the civil rights movement. Remember, World War II is happening in the 1940s. Get into the 1950s, that's when the civil rights movement. World War II, allowing African American soldiers to fight alongside the white soldiers. All of a sudden, that bleeds back into America and people want desegregation of things in America. Scrolling down here, challenging segregation in courts. We just talked about this. What did the Supreme Court rule about separate schools in Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas? Of course, Thurgood Marshall carried that case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional for whites and blacks to be separated because separate is never equal. The white water fountain, the black water fountain, the white area in the bus, the black area in the bus, white schools, black schools. Every time African Americans got the hand-me-downs, basically. And so that's the reason why separate was not equal, and that's the reason why the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional. Coming on down here, reactions to Brown versus Board of Education. My background changed back behind us, that's okay. Name 2 places that African Americans targeted for racial desegregation. Obviously, let me try to get that back up for us in the background. We'll just let that go. Y'all can look at the beautiful New York skyline. I guess what that is. Right now, I don't know what it is. Anyway, name 2 places where African Americans targeted racial desegregation. Couple of the places that we're going to see it, obviously, we're going to see it in the Rosa Parks bus boycott in Montgomery, as you read about there. But other places, there were boycotts kind of all over the place. Whether it was schools in Alabama, the University of Alabama, whether it's Ole Miss, one of the questions you had in your 19 questions was about James Meredith and him getting the ruling that he could go to the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. The Little Rock 9 up in Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas Central High School had to be desegregated, allow the 9 students to attend it. So schools, buses, businesses, those were the big things they pushed to have desegregation in first. The movement spreads, the last part of the lesson for lesson 1. Name 2 people from whom Martin Luther King drew his ideas. Where did he get his ideas for what he was doing? And we talked about this if you tuned in for our social civil disobedience. One of them obviously was Mohandas Gandhi up in India, or down in India, fighting against British oppression in the turn of the century in the 1920s and 30s. But the other one you might not have caught up on was he actually used Jesus. If you know anything about the Bible, if you know anything about Black history, is how important Christianity and the church was for African Americans. Really the only book they got to read during slavery, and usually it was read to them, was they were allowed the Bible. And of course, if you've ever read the Bible, a lot of that Old Testament's nothing but people trying to break out of bondage, break out of slavery. It's kind of like a how-to book of ending slavery. Probably not the best thing to read to a whole bunch of African-American slaves, is teach them how to revolt. Worked out well for them, though. So Jesus and Christianity was a big influence in Martin Luther King's ideas. So Jesus and Gandhi both played huge roles in what Martin Luther King was doing with his civil disobedience. Let's go over to lesson 2, talk about that. Just kind of recap on some of the things lesson 2 brought up. Triumph of Crusades. Of course, the big things are talked about here. Again, the Freedom Riders. That was one of the things, again, we talked about during our civil disobedience Wednesday night. James Meredith, who was the young African-American man that was allowed to go to Ole Miss during the civil rights movement, desegregation of the schools. 1964, we've already talked about this because we already talked about Lyndon Johnson, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed racial discrimination. All right, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck down state laws intended to keep blacks from voting. So all those are going to be important triumphs in the crusade. Let's look at some of the things here and go over some of the things you read. Again, I like doing this because it doesn't give you the answers to what you had to do for homework, but it does recap what we were doing. Name 2 ways that the government tried to help the Freedom Riders out. The Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, remember President Kennedy is the president in the early 60s. Freedom Riders left out in 1961. His brother Robert was the Attorney General. And one of the things that they did to help try and protect the Freedom Riders was they sent U.S. Marshals, 400 of them down, to try and protect the Freedom Riders as they moved through the South. They also banned any segregation along interstate highways. That's the Interstate Commerce and Commission. Waiting rooms, restaurants, lunch counters, that was all banned. Those are all things the federal government tried to do. The Kennedys boys, Robert and of course John F. Kennedy, tried to do to help the Freedom Riders on their trip. If you paid attention Wednesday night, you know the Freedom Riders was still a very damaging time period for the civil rights movement. You know, the riders were pulled off the buses in 1961 in Anniston, Alabama, and beaten to death. Happened several times, but Anniston was probably the worst of it, and just a real tough time. They did finish their freedom rides, but it was a lot bloodier and a lot more painful than probably they wanted that to happen. But freedom rides a big deal on civil disobedience. Standing firm, what happened in Birmingham? Of course, Birmingham is ground zero for the civil rights movement. Birmingham, Alabama, my state of Alabama. What was the outcome of the demonstrations in Birmingham? You know, Martin Luther King Jr. was actually arrested in Birmingham, and he wrote the famous letters to John F. Kennedy from the Birmingham jail, where they actually corresponded with each other. But the big villain, I guess you could say, in Birmingham is going to be the police commissioner, Bull Connor. And he's going to fight with everything he can. Of course, he's pushing the agenda of Governor George Wallace, the governor of Alabama during that time, and basically trying to stop any kind of desegregation that he could. Of course, several famous events happened in Birmingham during that time. You had the Children's Crusade, which is what this number 2 question is asking about. The outcome of the Children's Crusade is that the police actually put dogs and water hoses and attacked the children as they marched through Birmingham in what was supposed to be a peaceful protest. And of course, it just became a mess in downtown Birmingham. But, you know, wasn't just that. You know, another big event besides Martin Luther King Jr. getting arrested, and then, of course, the Children's Crusade being physically beaten up in Birmingham, was also you had the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. 4 little black girls at Sunday school on a beautiful Sunday morning. Bomb blew up at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and it killed those 4 little girls. And really a symbol of just how bad things were becoming in the Deep South. And again, Birmingham is like ground zero for everything that's happened in the civil rights movement. Moving on to the next question, it says, name 2 things the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, again, it was passed by President Johnson, and it was passed really in response to a lot of the violence and stuff that we had seen. You know, Martin Luther King Jr. Had called for harmony and peace in 1963 when he and 250,000 blacks and whites marched on Washington. You know, they called for a kind of a changing of the guard and basically a racial harmony. Of course, the very famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which was behind me on the TV, it's gone now because my computer's dropped the two internets. But I'm going to post the "I Have a Dream" speech for you over the weekend. I want you to listen to it. It's going to be on this post right here from Google Classroom. Great speech. You know, he didn't even write down the "I Have a Dream" speech. The speech he gave, the people were hot. They were beginning to get bored. It was in the middle of the summertime in 1963. And somebody next to Martin Luther King Jr. told him, said, "Martin, tell him about the dream." And he, off the top of his head, began telling the dream that he had of the little black boys and little black uh, white boys and little white girls and little black girls being able to, in harmony, play together and experience life together in the Deep South. You know, he talked about Governor Wallace and the viciousness, the hatred down in Alabama, and how those things need to change. One of the most touching, one of the most powerful speeches that's ever been given in history, really given on the fly. Remember, Martin Luther King Jr. was a terrific Southern Baptist preacher, and he could talk. He could talk. I still think it's his second best speech. I think the Sermon on the Mountain, I'll play for you next week. The mountaintop speech is really what they call it in Memphis the night before he died. I think that was probably his best speech, but definitely that, of course, "I Have a Dream" speech speaks for itself. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, though, two things that it did was it obviously worked to strike down any kind of hampering of the rights of and discrimination based on race, creed, or color. Trying to desegregate. And the other thing, besides outlawing racial discrimination, is it basically made it legal that the federal government could step in and intervene in those situations. Of course, also the Voting Rights Act, which is not mentioned there, but it's mentioned back up here at the top, of 1965, a year later, made it able for African Americans, obviously, to vote without having to pay poll taxes, without having to really go through any kind of hoops to vote like they had. And of course, it's mentioned right there. I'm sorry. It says here, name two states where civil rights workers tried to register black voters. The couple of states that are mentioned here, of course, is going to be Mississippi and Alabama. Those are going to be really the two hot blood areas where it's really tough. Of course, in 1965, you have the Selma to Montgomery March, where they're going to march across the bridge from Selma, Alabama, up to Montgomery, Alabama, and talk to Governor Wallace. And of course, the people walking across the bridge will be attacked. And all it does is, instead of 300 people marching from Selma to Montgomery, it became a crowd of 25,000 people that came back later that year and did the Selma to Montgomery March successfully. So again, a couple big things there. To wrap up lesson 3, or to wrap the whole thing up, let's talk about the other side. We've talked a whole bunch about all the good things that was happening. Let's talk about some of the more violent approaches to the civil rights movement. Of course, Malcolm X is the man, African-American civil rights leader of the Nation of Islam. The group was really headed by Elijah Muhammad, and they brought in, of course, Malcolm X. But they really look at desegregation by all means necessary. You can't just sit back and take it. You got to fight back. That meant killing somebody. You had to kill somebody to make a point. Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, who will start and will run the Black Power movement. Of course, later on, the actual Black Panther group that will become as powerful, probably a group in the 60s as protesters that you can have trying to improve racial relations in America. Of course, kind of going through some of the questions and stuff here, it says, name two problems that African Americans in the North faced. And we've talked a lot about the South, but not the North. And, lost it there. Let me come back up here to it. A couple of the things that they faced that nobody really talked about. Everybody talked about the Southern stuff. Was, first of all, de facto segregation that was really out of practice and customs. I mean, in the South, it was by law to segregate everybody. In the North, people were just separated. People were segregated. I remember when I was in college, Pete Matthews, who was a on Governor Wallace's attempt to run for president when he ran for president. Pete Matthews come and talked to us, and he said one of the most racist, most heated rallies that Governor Wallace had when he ran for president is that they went to a place in Minnesota, and so it was just a group of white people, and said it was as hated and it was as aggressive towards African Americans as anything that happened in Alabama or Mississippi. The biggest difference in the North is there were not as many black people in the North. So blacks and whites didn't really live together in the North like they did in the South. And so there's still a lot of racism, still a lot of discrimination in the North. You just don't hear about it as much because they're not there to butt heads like they are in the South. So a big thing. In some places, they were segregated by actual law, de jure segregation. And both of those things are things they tried to eliminate in the northern states. All right. Number 2 here on lesson 3's name 2 new civil rights leaders that began popping up in the late 60s. Of course, that's Malcolm X, who will follow the preachings of Elijah Muhammad and Nation of Islam. He declares that whites were responsible for blacks' misery, and he urged African Americans to fight back when they were attacked. Of course, eventually Malcolm X did change his policies regarding violence. As he aged, he argued that African Americans should use peaceful means, especially voting, to win equality. The only problem with that is after he made his pilgrimage to Mecca and he came back a little more peaceful, Malcolm X, he didn't get a lot of time to show that side of himself because he was assassinated in February of 1965. And of course, that event is going to be just a major kind of avalanche of bad things that's going to happen on the back half of the 60s in the civil rights movement. Stokely Carmichael, another one that's going to be important for the movement. Of course, he leads the Black Power and the Black Panther Party. So both of those guys are going to be other people besides Martin Luther King Jr. that were important to this. You see my penguins in the background. All right, moving on. Last thing to talk about, or last couple of things to talk about here. Who are the 2 famous people that are going to be assassinated in the civil rights movement in the 1968? 1968, one of the worst years in American history. I don't know if it's going to beat 2020 right now, but pretty bad. Martin Luther King Jr., obviously, in April of 1968, is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm going to send you on a virtual field trip to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis next week, and you can see the room and the ledge where Martin Luther King Jr. was shot while he was in Memphis. He's killed, and the only other hope the country had was in 1968. Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, was running for president. Remember, John F. Kennedy was killed in 1963 by an assassin. Robert Kennedy will speak and will run for president in 1968. And he was the front runner. He's the one that everybody pretty much expected was going to win the presidency in 1968. And unfortunately, out in California, he's going to be killed in June of that year, just a few months after Martin Luther King Jr. He's assassinated by an Israeli by the name of Sirhan Sirhan. And it is it's just obviously just a horrible moment as far as the civil rights movement goes. And it really sets the 60s off as just the unspoken, believable, turbulent time that the 60s will be. You got to remember also one other thing that's happened besides these assassinations, besides the civil rights movement, besides all the things that we've talked about in the past few weeks, is you also got Vietnam that's kicking off. And we're going to talk about Vietnam in a few weeks, but Vietnam was going strong as this is happening too. And so just a lot of turmoil in 1968. The movement continues and kind of where things wrap up with the first half of this. One goal the civil rights movement achieved, and one challenge that remained. Obviously, the Voting Rights Act and the call for the end of racism and basically to shut down the white oppression that the government pretty much allowed. Those are things that were achieved in the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65 were huge achievements for African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement. Desegregation, huge achievement. But one of the things that needed to still happen is what's called affirmative action. And that is during the late 60s, the federal government began to push to get African Americans hired into jobs and into programs to help them get in equal ground. One of the things was opportunity, having the opportunities to advance themselves. And that was one of the challenges the government put out there. Was the government made basically our country, made businesses, made colleges and stuff, opened themselves up more to give African Americans an opportunity to improve their way of life. All right. That's a lot for tonight. Again, I just wanted to hit over all that stuff because that's really our lesson for the week. That's the first 3 lessons from civil rights movement. That's what your main focus was this week, was on those. Don't forget your textbook and all these pictures and stuff. Hopefully you use those to answer your questions as you've gone this week. Let me stop sharing. Let me come back here today. Ooh, got my Glory Days grill hat on. Big shout out to Glory Days. If you don't know, they've been a big sponsor for our school the last few months as the school year is progressing. New restaurant over there in South Fort Myers, and got their little hat on they gave us for our game against Cypress Lake at the beginning of the year. I hope everything's going good for you. They say the next 2 weeks is going to be the toughest part of this coronavirus, and hopefully, we'll get through this next month and move forward. Everything's going good here with my family. Nobody's sick. Everybody's stir crazy, ready to get out of this house. We've been trying to get out and walk. Embry's been working on softball. Julie is a high school kid, so she's like a lot of you. She's not doing a whole lot of anything, but she's happy. And of course, Will's still working on his college stuff. FSW's hitting him pretty hard. My wife is now home with us. She had to work a lot earlier in the week, but now they've sent her home, and she's working from home just like me. Hopefully get some more communication with you this week going into the Zoom meeting on Tuesday. Like I said, I'm going to try to schedule 3 meetings on Tuesday, and hopefully you can meet and see me and talk to me a little bit on one of those. Keep texting me, keep emailing me. I appreciate it. I know Mr. Matthews is doing little updates every day on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Do what you can do. A lot of you have called or text or, like I said, emailed me, and I appreciate it. Feel free to comment on this. Keep it clean, of course, to comment on your Google Classroom, but feel free to say, hey, how you doing, all those things. Try to make it a little more interactive next week instead of just answering some questions. We'll try to post some stuff up there where you got to comment on the classroom and maybe make it a little bit more interaction between us because of what's going on. I hope you're doing good with your other classes. Keep checking in. Stay ahead on your Google Classroom. Stay up with your teachers, guys. Don't fall behind this last quarter with all this mess that's going on. Man, how about all these great pictures behind me? Not really. All right, well, I tried. I will be back on Monday. Get your stuff turned in today. Remember to turn in your weekly assignment. Your Monday assignment is due right now to be turned in. Make sure you've turned in your essay from Wednesday, and make sure that I know that you've been on this Google Classroom. Comment on something so I know that you've been here. Hopefully, if you just turn your work in today and you turned your stuff in on Wednesday, I'm going to know you were here. So that's good. I will see you Monday. Have a great weekend. Go Wolfpack. Still looking good. Your boy looks good. Bye-bye, folks. Have a good weekend.